Okay, so it's already 2 p.m. I think we can wait some 30 more seconds before we start. All right, I think we can start now. So, hello everyone. I hope you are all in good spirits. We are glad to have you all with us. My name is Abib Abdelaziz Sow, and I'm working as a program manager for the GI-TOC West Africa Observatory. We are here together today, as you know, to bring together a discussion on the role of the Wagner Group in Mali, with a particular focus on their arms supplies and its implications for international arms controls regime. The aforementioned draws from a recent study the GI-TOC has published on the issue. To do so, we have brought together a panel of leading experts on security dynamics in Mali to discuss the role of the Wagner Group and Africa Corps, their impact on instability in Mali, and Russia's political positioning in the Sahel. As a head-ups, let me remind that we will have introductory remarks given by Michel Small from the United Nations Working Group on Mercenaries, then 4 panelists to discuss the topic. Afterward, we will open the Q&A section and you will be able to submit your questions throughout for them to be addressed at the end. Please note that there is a French-English simultaneous translation given. You can listen either in English or French at your convenience by selecting your preferred language by clicking on the 3 dots at the bottom right of your screen and then click on interpretation in the options. Now, without further delay, let me introduce Dr. Michel Small, who is the Africa member on the United Nations Working Group on the use of mercenaries as a means of violating human rights and impeding the rights of people to self-determination. She also serves as a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Dr. Michel, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Habib, for that introduction, and greeting to you and all the other panelists, and thank you to GI-TOC for this opportunity. I'd like to begin with just a brief background on who the working group on the use of mercenaries are and what we do, just for those who are unfamiliar with us. We are composed of 5 independent experts drawn from different geographical regions, and we are mandated to monitor mercenaries, mercenary-related actors, and private military and security companies in all their forms and manifestations, both online and offline, across domains, so that being land, sea, air, cyber, and space. We are also mandated to monitor the human rights impacts of these actors, particularly on the right of peoples to self-determination. And we report our findings via 2 annual thematic reports submitted to the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. This year, we produced reports on the connections of actors under our mandate in relation to natural resources as well as proxies. And last year, we produced reports on arms trafficking and illicit financing. And you can find these reports on our website. We also transmit communications to governments and other actors who fall under our mandate where there are specific allegations on human rights violations or impeding the right of people to self-determination or undermining constitutional order, and we welcome any information in this regard, which can be submitted via a dedicated and confidential site, which can be found on our webpage. Now to get to mercenaries, related actors, and PMSCs and arms. In our thematic reports, we have repeatedly highlighted that the use, recruitment, training, arming, equipping, financing, and transit of mercenaries, related actors, and PMSCs remains a systemic and growing problem that cuts across regions, countries, conflicts, as well as issue areas such as the one we are looking at today, arms. And these intersections have increased to levels not seen before. Indeed, as our work has shown, mercenaries, related actors, and some, and I underscore some, private military and security companies benefit from ongoing conflicts as their presence sustains the demand for arms and the duration and intensity of conflicts. The title of the seminar today on private military companies, the Wagner Group and Mali, is a good starting point. So let me begin with PMSC. From the perspective of the working group, Wagner has shifted from being a privately owned and incorporated military company, so PMC, while under Prigozhin, to being reorganized and incorporated under the Russian government, specifically the Ministry of Defense, following Prigozhin's death in 2023, such that the Wagner Group now functions as a state-owned paramilitary entity and not a PMC. And this is one of the reasons why a mandate looks at a range of actors, but also the shifting sands in the supply of paid military and security services. And a quick moment for me to clarify: mercenary, private military and security company, and mercenary related actors, as they're often employed without precision, or they are politicized. So a mercenary is found in both Article 47, Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and the 1989 International Convention against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries, known as the UN Convention on Mercenaries. Under the Geneva Conventions, 6 cumulative criteria must be met in order to qualify as a mercenary. These are: a mercenary is someone who is specifically recruited to fight in an armed conflict, takes part in direct hostilities, is motivated essentially by private gain, is promised material compensation that exceeds that paid to nationals, is neither a national nor a resident of the party to the conflict, and is not a member of the armed forces. So owing to this cumulative criteria, you can see that who a mercenary is quite specific in terms of fulfilling this criteria. The UN Convention extends this a bit and applies the term to beyond just international armed conflict, but also to any person who recruits, uses, finances, or trains mercenaries, as well as their direct participation in concerted acts of violence. So this would be, for example, overthrowing a government or undermining the constitutional order. Given that the Geneva Conventions is 76 years old and the UN Convention text was written 36 years ago, you can see that these definitions are somewhat limiting owing to the changed geopolitical context today. And what we have seen is what we term mercenary-related actors. And these actors are what my colleague likes to call smells like and looks like a mercenary, but is not a mercenary, owing to these narrow legal definitions. Mercenary-related actors are not national armed forces. They are not professional soldiers. They are entities which are composed of individuals who may be former military or security personnel, who may be former fighters, who may be armed individuals, but who band together for the purpose of fighting or for offensive services, and are often ideologically composed or aligned, are state-aligned or state-owned. And there's much secrecy and opacity in terms of these formations and incorporations of mercenary-related actors. Now shifting to PMSCs, it's important to note that there is no universally accepted or legal binding definition of a military company or a security company. However, the working group conceives of private military and security companies as corporate entities that are registered and provide on a compensatory basis military and or security services. And these ranges from guarding, close protection, monitoring, military consulting and training to combat services. And it's here where actors often contribute to the proliferation and diffusion of weaponry around the world. So now to get to how they connected to arms. In the 2024 Arms Report, the working group set out quite clearly that states remain the main suppliers and licensors of arms, and that most of the trade in major conventional weapons is legal and interstate and is well documented and tracked. However, data on the trade and trafficking of portable, concealable, and lethal small arms and light weapons particularly amongst non-state actors such as mercenaries, related actors, and PMSCs, as well as transnational organized criminal networks, is inconsistent, missing, and full of holes and gaps. So how are mercenaries, related actors, and PMSCs connected to arms? The first avenue, and I'll give essentially three main ways. The first avenue is through the direct supply by states to mainly PMSCs. Here, state contracting sees states supply weapons and arms to PMSCs through legal contracts and end user certificates, which specifies, or should specify, the intended recipient, but also the intended purpose of the arms. Arms and weapons are also, or should be, marked, registered, counted, and assigned as per state reporting obligations. Unfortunately, some states do not uphold or consistently apply the EUC, and irregularities such as forging and fabrication of export licenses, labels, registry permits does occur. I will also bracket here that PMSCs can and have also supplied states with arms and weapons. Some states and regions still do not have robust national or regional regulation regarding arms transfers, and so some states subdelegate this responsibility to such entities. Also falling under this first avenue of state supply is where states directly supply arms and weapons to mercenaries and related actors, what is termed state rerouting. So here, state-to-state sales and supplies are rerouted and transferred from being a state asset to being placed in the control and usage of mercenaries and related actors. And this is often for the purposes of actors engaging in combat and fighting, either in the state's own territory or in the territories of others. And some states deliberately involve other states as enablers in this arms transfer through the use of their airfields, bases, planes, ports, and cargo. The second route, mainly connected with mercenaries and related actors, is through diversion. And this entails the seizure of state stockpiles or the illegal sale of state stockpiles in the aftermath of wars, changes in government, to such actors. Seizure can also be through direct attacks on border security or army posts and convoys. In some cases, corrupt state officials, ex-government forces, or even soldiers who've defected also facilitate this diversion and sale of arms to mercenaries and related actors from state stockpiles and armories. The third and final avenue, and the one that is of particular concern, is through illegal, criminal, and opaque trafficking networks, brokers, shell companies, and intermediaries. All actors under our mandate have been implicated in the purchase of arms and weapons through such networks, as well as the supply to such networks. Unregulated or free trade zones represent a key channel for such movement, transshipment, storage, and redistribution. The illegal sale and supplies of arms and weapons has also been between mercenaries, related actors, and private military and security companies themselves, as well as combatants. And here, arms trafficking and transfer is used as a form of self-funding. Weapons sold on the darknet utilizing e-platforms and alternative banking systems such as cryptocurrencies represent part of the new challenges surrounding these actors and arms proliferation. Of particular concern is the illicit transportation of weapons, material, and personnel by sea as a means to circumvent arms embargoes through floating vessel-based armories, which, if you are interested in, the UN Security Council panel of experts goes into great detail about. It is important to state here for those in the room from industry that while most private military and security companies are structured business organizations that avoid reputational risks and transactions costs associated with exchanges on illegal markets, some do engage in trafficking. And here the Intergovernmental Working Group, what is termed the IGWG, on private military and security companies, an instrument currently being negotiated in Geneva by states, has a role to play in regulating PMSCs, particularly with regards to their connections to arms supplies and sales. I will close here by pointing to how the rapid development and deployment of new technologies in the manufacturing of arms, such as additive technologies like 3D, three-dimensional printed firearms, semi-automatic weapons, and ghost guns, as well as the refitting or reconversion of commercial uncrewed aerial devices, popularly known as drones, is creating fresh challenges across the battlefield and across domains today, particularly with regards to unauthorized uses that fall under our mandate and other armed groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michelle, for your great insights. We will now move to the panel discussion that will be animated by Julia Stanyard, Usman Ali Jallo, Nina Whelan, and Enin Saidia. Just as a reminder, we encourage you to participate in the discussion by submitting your questions to our speakers using the Q&A function. We will start with Julia Stanyard, who is a senior analyst working with the Global Initiatives Organized Crime Observatory for East and Southern Africa. She works on the risk built-in of illicit economies in East and Southern Africa and is currently researching drug trafficking and maritime trafficking through the Indian Ocean island states. Her previous research has focused on trafficking in cultural property, particularly in West Africa, as well as research projects focusing on drug trafficking and the UN response to organized crime. She joined the Global Initiative in August 2018 and hold a master's degree in criminology. She will share some of the findings of the recent GI-TOC paper, which has analyzed Wagner arms supplies in Mali. Julia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Habib, for the introduction, and thank you, Michelle, for your introductory remarks. That was really interesting to hear the UN Working Group's perspective on this. And thank you to everyone for joining today. I hope it's going to be a useful discussion for you all. Claudia, would you be able to share the presentation, please? All right, thank you. So firstly, just to introduce a little the parameters of the study that we just published, came out a couple of weeks ago. It's available on our website. I think the link is available in the chat already. So if you'd like to peruse in more detail, please do. So to start with, just to say what we were looking at, the Global Initiative has been monitoring the role of the Wagner Group as part of a broader interest in the links between PMCs, mercenaries, and illicit economies over the past 2 to 3 years now. And we also had a focus on Mali as part of our West Africa Observatory and monitoring illicit economies of various kinds in the country. So this is within the remit of previous research projects we have done, and within that we wanted to look at Wagner's arms supplies. There is a lot of material available online showing Wagner Group's operations in Mali, with those images, videos circulating, which show the types of weapons that they're using and how and where they are using them. We wanted to make use of this material. We wanted to find out where they're getting weapons from, or where we're getting weapons from before they're replaced with Africa Corps, something we'll go into in more depth later on in the discussion. Where they're getting weapons from, how, and what the implications of this are, for legal arms control regimes. And overall, our findings was that they were getting weapons from different sources. Some, especially the small arms, were brought with the mercenaries from Russia. Some were weapons which were seized from the field from extremist groups, then recycled into the Wagner's own armories in a quite ad hoc way. Especially when they're first arriving in Mali, they were actually quite poorly equipped and needed to make use of arms from different sources. And crucially, one of the key findings that we had is that there's this phenomenon of rerouting, which Michelle has already flagged, that the UN Working Group flagged in their 2024 report, where it appears that weapons which were exported from other countries to Mali legally, where the Malian army was designated as the sole end user, were then illegally rerouted and diverted to Wagner. So naturally, this undermines the legal basis for those arms exports, the kind of assumptions on which these exports would have been made. Mali would have been designated as the sole end user in the end user certificates, which are part of the legal documentation around arms exports. And this, we believe, has facilitated Wagner's operations in Mali, of course, including committing serious human rights abuses. So this study, we believe, serves as a kind of case study of the phenomenon that the UN Working Group has highlighted, but also offers us a new insight into the way that Wagner Group operated in Mali, and seeing as Russia has an ongoing role in the country through the Africa Corps, something we believe contributes to our understanding of the situation today. So to first go over what our research methods were in this study. So the first step that we took was to assemble a database of open source data. So that's images and video, documenting Wagner troops in Mali. So this kind of digital evidence has really become a mainstay for research and analysis of conflict, via open source routes, in particularly mercenary activity, particularly in hard to access conflict zones, as it provides a set of visual evidence that is key for these sorts of research projects. And in this particular instance, allowed us to identify specific models, of weaponry, of vehicles, in order to be able to track back those supply chains. So we were sourcing these from a range of online sources, including there's lots of pro-Wagner Telegram channels which circulate this material, material shared by farmer soldiers sometimes on social media, and also shared by the extremist groups against which Wagner was fighting. So the data that we collated included images posted between January 2022 and June this year, just before the changeover from Wagner Group to Africa Corps. Brought together around 160 photos and videos, 170 around that ballpark, also of arms that were seized. And then we selected from this initial larger database to narrow down to those images where we could both be confident of the type of arms that you could see in the images and videos, identify the equipment, and also be confident that those images were taken in Mali. So, for example, that includes images showing Wagner groups with identifiable FAMA troops, the Forces Armées Maliennes, those wearing FAMA insignia, or where, for example, there might be geographical features which allowed us to geolocate the images. So we narrowed that search selection down. After that, we were able to cross-reference what we'd found with interview data taken, by our field research team, with sources within the Malian military, including senior mid-level officers, talking to them about and asking them questions about how the operations with Wagner worked, and any arms sharing that may have occurred. So we're able to both see the online open source data and cross-reference that with information from the ground. After that, we then wanted to look to arms transfer databases and public reporting about arms transfer. So if we'd identified, for example, a particular type of armored vehicle, we'd be able to go back into an arms transfer database, see where that was transferred from, when that was transferred to Mali, in order to build ourselves a timeline about when certain transfers occurred. Once we'd identified these key examples, we then, as a final step, also approached for right of reply for response for these arms suppliers and the countries which exported those arms, in order to confirm, for example, that yes, this was exported to Mali, this was exported for the exclusive use of the Malian army, and therefore providing more evidence that the rerouting to Wagner was an illegitimate diversion. So to move on to the next slide, please, Claudia. To our findings. So we found that it appeared to be a common farmer policy to share certain types of equipment fairly freely with Wagner. So this goes into three main categories. The first was that we found 5 different examples where Wagner appeared to be using armored vehicles that were belonging to FAMA. These 5 different types of vehicles coming from 4 source countries, of which there were China, 2 types of vehicles which had been imported from the UAE, another example from Nigeria, and 1 example from France. 4 of these vehicle types appeared to have been direct arms transfers to Mali, and there was 1 isolated example, 1 individual vehicle, which appeared to have been transferred to Chad and then used as in Mali as part of MINUSMA operations. And I will also stress that some of these examples had been transferred to Mali before Wagner's arrival, and some had been transferred after, and that, of course, has different legal and ethical implications, which I'll come on to. We didn't get a response from all of the companies involved, of course, but for those that did, two of these companies which exported armoured vehicles, one confirmed it had been exported to the Malian military, the other confirmed that it had been exported to Chad, which then later used in Mali. Moving on from armoured vehicles, the second example, sorry, could we go back to the previous slide? I'm just on the second example, is of the technicals, which are the vehicles where there's a machine gun or a large weapon mounted on the back. These are primarily equipped with Chinese type W85 machine guns. It was not possible for us to identify when these were transferred to Mali, and that's perhaps not surprising. Many of the Chinese arms exports don't appear in official databases, but it was possible for us to see Wagner troops using these vehicles, which appear to be farmer vehicles. They're equipped in the farmer types of camouflage. We can be confident that that's a further example of this arms sharing. So able to confirm that both with interview data and through images. The final example that we had is of the attack drones, the Turkish drones that are supplied to Mali. There were 5 different interview sources that claimed that Wagner troops had operated these drones on behalf of FAMA. It was not possible to back this up with imagery in the same way as it is for the armoured vehicles. For those ones, it's quite easy to find these images that show directly Wagner troops piloting and using those vehicles. For a drone, something that's piloted remotely, it's not so easy to do that. But it was consistent across our interview data. We did get a response from Baykar, the company that produces those drones, and they denied that they would be used by a third party in this way. So I will clarify that from a legal perspective. But collectively, the examples that we found, and there's much more detail of these, of course, in our report. It does seem quite consistent that it seemed to be FAMA policy to share this kind of equipment freely with Wagner. And actually, similar diversions or similar rerouting was also documented as being conducted by Wagner by the UN panel of experts on the Central African Republic. So it seems to be a Wagner approach to using military equipment, which is not isolated to Mali. If we go to the next slide, please. Right, so we'd like to look into the implications. What does it mean that they're rerouting Malian military equipment in this way? So firstly, we looked at the Arms Trade Treaty, which is obviously the primary piece of international legislation governing the arms trade. Mali itself is actually a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty, and within the treaty, there are of course obligations for countries to prevent diversion within their own country, meaning that Mali has actually failed on those obligations. For the other countries which have exported this material to Mali, China, Nigeria, France are all signatories to the Arms Trade Treaty and involved in the arms transferred analysed, whereas, for example, others, such as the UAE and Turkey, are signatories but have not yet ratified or approved the treaty. Under the Arms Trade Treaty, Article 6, Article 7, states do have a legal obligation to assess the risk that an arms transfer could be used to undermine peace and security, violate humanitarian or human rights law, commit war crimes, so on and so forth. For those countries that aren't parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, lots of them have domestic legislation that achieves much of that same aim as well. So say, for example, we're looking to the UAE as a source for some of these armoured vehicles. Its export regime firstly requires that armoured vehicles have an export end user certificate before they can be exported, and their export regime aims to they make public statements to say that this export regime aims to contribute to UN Security Council resolutions to counter arms proliferation and so on. So there are kind of other, even when they're not part of the Arms Trade Treaty, other legal obligations that should be considered. I would also stress that for some of the these arms exports, these transfers were made before Wagner's arrival in Mali, meaning, of course, that under the Arms Trade Treaty obligations or other domestic legislation, it would not be possible to assess this risk that these arms could be rerouted. So it's not a question over whether those transfers were, whether that should have been considered as a risk for those transfers, but it does still, nonetheless show us that this rerouting was a policy, by the Malian army. But for other examples of these transfers, some of them, they were made after Wagner's arrival in Mali and after there was evidence available showing publicly that arms would be rerouted from Farmer to Wagner. Some of the information that we've drawn on in this research, was already publicly out there. So these were, for example, transfers made by China, transfers made from the UAE, and transfers made from Turkey as well. And arguably, this information could or even should have been a reason for those arms transfers to not have been made. To move on to the next slide, please. Claudia, could we have the next slide, please? It appears to me that the slide's not moving, but we are just moving on to the conclusions. I'm conscious of time. Thank you. That's great. Okay, so just to wrap up, I realize we've covered a lot of ground here, and as I said, much more detail on these, especially the more technical aspects, is available in our report. But just to conclude, what we think the implications of this are and what this means in the bigger picture is that firstly, the availability of farmers' weapons and vehicles to Wagner during their operations in Mali, we think this facilitated some of the atrocities that they committed, which I think some of the other panelists, Usman, will go into in more detail, and the human rights implications of Wagner's actions in Mali. Things like armored vehicles, they're essential to allowing those military operations to take place. And more broadly, the rerouting of these state-to-state transfers, it undermines international arms control regimes, the very principle of there being a designated end user who is the sole user of that weapon, those weapons which are being exported. That's really the basis upon which these arms transfers are made, which is being undermined. And broadly, this phenomenon highlights the importance of applying and actually enforcing end user verification and due diligence on obligations in terms of arms transfers. So while it's one specific example that we've drawn up here of Mali, of Wagner, and their operations there, we do think this has broader implications going forward. So thank you all very much for listening. Looking forward to the Q&A, and if, like I said, the report is available on our website, and looking forward to discussing further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia, for your presentations and for the insights you gave us. We will now have Usman Ali Jallo, who is a senior researcher for the Sahel at Amnesty International Regional Office for West and Central Africa in Dakar. He has been covering human rights issues in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Senegal, with a particular focus on violations of civil and political liberties, the impact of the armed insurgency in the Sahel on human rights, especially on civilian population living in conflict zones. He will share some views from Amnesty on the impact of the Wagner Group Africa Corps on human rights in Mali. Dear Usman, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Habib, and congratulations to the whole GI-TOC team for this brilliant report on arms diversion by Wagner in Mali. So my name is Usman Diallo, and I've been working on the Sahel for 6 years now, almost 6 years. And during that span, we have seen the deployment of Wagner in Mali, beginning in late 2021 to the rehatting under the Africa Corps this past June. I think I would like to raise some few points related to international humanitarian law violations and human rights law violations that have occurred during this 3-year period during which Wagner was actively operating in Mali in tandem with the Malian armed forces. But I would like to start my presentation with a disclaimer. So we talk a lot about Wagner PMC being deployed in Mali, but according to the official government narrative, there is no Wagner in Mali. So they have been denying that for a long time, despite all evidence by local sources that we talk to, by even military officers in Mali, and by Wagner's own open sources, such as their open discussion channels through Telegram and other mechanisms. And so despite this narrative by the government of having only military instructors deployed as part of defense agreement with Russia. We know that the Wagner PMC has been active in Mali during that period and has committed, in tandem with the Malian armed forces, some of the grossest human rights violations in this since the beginning of this conflict. So, despite this doublespeak, we know that Wagner operates in different ways. First, it's shadowy. They have been deployed at the front lines in the central Mali and then progressively in the north as part of the army's intensification of operations. And their deployment was also characterized by brutality and a complete disregard for international humanitarian law. And in this, they were protected by the Malian state, by the Malian armed forces, which never tried to rein, or we can even doubt about their capacities to rein in Wagner excesses in those military operations. And when we talk with civilians in Mali, with people that are still located in rural regions in central Mali, or those that have crossed the border into Mauritania, one thing that comes often in our speech is the brutality of Wagner operations, such as cases of massive extrajudicial executions, unlawful killings, and also cases of arbitrary, illegal detentions rather, and torture that occurs in various military camps. So whether it is the camp in Djabali in central Mali or Lere in the Tombouctou region, or even in Ségou. So people have been very vocal about the brutality of these operations. And it's important to flag again that civilians, Malian civilians, especially those at the front lines, have felt the brunt of these military operations by Wagner during the period between 2022 to 2023, at the end of that year, or rather 2024. We have seen an intensification of military operations by the FAMA and Wagner, by this whole speech about the scaling up of military operations by the FAMA, by the departure of Barkhane and the UN mission. And there was this official narrative about la montée en puissance des forces armées maliennes. And whenever we talk about intensification of military operations, we talk also about a rise in civilian casualties following these military operations. And I think even though prior to 2021, late 2021, there were a lot of mass massacres of civilians committed by all belligerent parties, whether the Malian army, whether it is the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, or even the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara or the Islamic State in the Sahel province. What we have noticed with the deployment of Wagner as part of its rules of engagement is the specific targeting of communities that are punished collectively as part of these military operations. I think one notable case is the collective targeting of Fulanis that have started in Mali, especially in 2022, beginning in 2022, and progressively the Tuareg and Arab communities, because in the new narrative, it's collateral damages as part of the military operations. If civilians are killed by mistake or even by sheer political will to send a signal, it's all right. And so this impunity has been characteristic of these military operations. And I think one notable example is the extrajudicial executions and unlawful killings that occurred in Mora, which is a small village in the inner Niger Delta in central Mali, during a 5-day operation by the Malian army and Wagner. And during that 5-day military operation, after initial fighting with members of an insurgent groups that were attending the weekly fair market, the army besieged the city, no, the town rather, the village, and conducted military operations, arrested men, separated them from women, and proceeded to killing, according to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, almost 500 persons during that 5-day operation. And they committed also other war crimes such as the rape and sexual violence against at least 54 women and girls. during the Moura operation. And this created a scandal because if you look at the timeline of the Malian conflict, Moura is probably the single most violent incident since the beginning of the conflict in 2012. And it was characteristic of Wagner operations in Mali. Moura was located in an area dominated by armed groups such as the Katiba Masina for several years prior, when the state of Mali and its army retreated to the local district, local capital, regional capitals, and abandoned the hinterlands to armed groups. And for a long time, these villages were living under the influence of armed groups, so operating under their code and because there was no state. And when during these military operations that were characteristic of Wagner in 2022, there was a collective punishment that was meted against the whole village, which has been deserted since then. Because following the violence, most of the villagers left. There was a big discussion at the national and domestic scenes, and the Malian judiciary, the military tribunal based in Mopti, which covers that area, announced an investigation into those allegations because they couldn't hide it anymore. And but since then, there has been no progress. Rather, we have seen that the episode of Moura has become a flashpoint in the tensions between the then UN mission and the Malian government and Wagner, because it's following the report by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights that the Malian government denounced the UN presence and called for their departure. So, this human rights element within MINUSMA was very troublesome to Malian authorities, who were not intent on investigating or providing justice, reparations, and even a guarantee of non-repetition to the victims. And Moura might be the most violent, but there were several other flashpoints and episodes where collective punishment was meted out against rural and communities in central Mali. There is a case of Dangene Wotoro where cattle herders were arrested and then burned to death by Wagner and Fama in February 2022. But there were also cases in Niawuro and other local villages in the Jene district that led to mass departure and mass flights. And so in this context, we have seen massive departures and a humanitarian catastrophe in central Mali, with many villages crossing over to Mauritania, trying to seek relief and protection. And since 2023, this number of Malian people from the regions of Nara, Timbuktu, and Ségou crossing over to Mauritania has only increased. And we are actually conducting research on some of these incidents that have occurred along that border by going to southern Mauritania, because some of the okay, I'm reading Abib's message, because some of the issues right now when investigating human rights is the lack of access to the field, because people are scared of talking to human rights organizations. There are cases of reprisals by the state when local villagers take pictures or talk to CSOs or NGOs. So it becomes very difficult to conduct research and on human rights in Mali. And one of the best ways is to go to neighboring countries. So the state is trying to restrict the diffusion of atrocities and Wagner operations by intimidating local sources and villagers from going. And I think there is a big element also of psychological intimidation in Wagner operations. When talking with refugees that have crossed to Mauritania, they talk also a lot about cases of detention and torture, like in the army camps of Djabali, of Lere, of Gundam, also of Sevare. And they provided interesting details about how they operate, how Wagner completely operates independently from the Malian army. They have no oversight over their activities, especially on cases of torture that they commit. And it could be torture by electrocution, by waterboarding, and also by several beatings to people that have been detained there and that are interviewed by Wagner about the presence of armed groups and whether they have been in collusion or whether they pay, let's say, local taxes to armed groups. And I think also I'm going to conclude by this. I think impunity is rife in Mali because with Wagner, if before 2022 we often had cases of the Malian state announcing investigations and opening investigations, since Moura, there has been no investigations open on cases of extrajudicial executions and allegations of rapes and torture that have been committed either by Fama or by the Wagner. So people in those areas are very afraid even of going to the judiciary to inquire about villagers that have been arrested or that have been detained somewhere because they fear the risk of reprisals. There have been cases of village chiefs, notabilities that have just decided to flee rather than go to state institutions and inquire about the fates of their relatives or of their neighbors, for example. And I think it has also affected the environment in Mali. There has been a lot of talk about patriotic treatment of information, like to downsize or to minimize the impact of these operations in favor of a narrative that promotes national sovereignty and army successes against armed groups. And even civil society organizations in Mali that used to mediate between villages and the state institutions, such as the intelligence services, do not dare continue that role because the risk of reprisals are very, very high. So I'm going to conclude here. There is much to say and much to talk about Wagner operations, especially related to human rights and international humanitarian law. But I think the complete disregard of any respect to the law and the sheer brutality meted out against communities through collective punishments or reprisals following military setbacks have been very characteristic of these operations by Wagner. Thank you very much, and looking forward to interacting in the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much, Usman. Thank you for your insight. And yeah, you are kindly reminded to ask your question to the Q&A section. So we will now give the floor to Nina Whelan, who is the director of the Africa program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations and associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the Lyon University. Her recent papers have covered engagement in the Sahel by Russia, China, Turkey, and the Gulf states, and the withdrawal process of MINUSMA in Mali and its impact on security. She will comment on how Wagner Group's operations in Mali fit within the broader patterns of Russian engagement and strategic realignment across the Sahel, as their recent organization paper covered, and how that compares to the engagement by the other countries such as China, Turkey, and the Gulf states. Nina, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, so I was taught to take a more of a zoom out approach to the question that we're discussing here. I would like perhaps to start to say that while I draw some of the points I make in this paper on a recent article published with the Egmont Institute earlier this year, I would like to draw some attention to a book that I just published with Oxford University Press, which is called Securitizing the Sahel, Analyzing External Interventions and Their Consequences, which is basically taking quite a broad and a deep look into the different types of external interventions that have taken place in the Sahel over the past 10 years. So not only focusing on Russia, but also on Western actors. Having said that, I'm now going towards the question that I was asked to speak about, and I will make 3 points during my short presentations. The first one is that although we're talking about non-Western authoritarian states, which are all expanding their influence and their presence in Africa more broadly, they do so in very different ways. So I think it's important that we make clear distinctions when we talk about Russia, China, Turkey, or the Gulf states. My second point is that Russia has used a narrative of sovereignty and empowerment in its engagement with its African partners. But in practice, it has also often locked in these partners in different ways. So quite contrary to this empowerment narrative, they have tried to isolate the partners in different ways. And I'll go into this in a little bit. And then my third point is that while Russia has gotten most of the attention in the media over the past 4 years or so, since Wagner troops debarked in Mali, I think that today we should turn the gaze towards Turkey and the Gulf states, because I think that these are the new actors that are having quite a large influence, especially in the Sahel state, but also if we look across the region, across the continent, towards the other side, also in the Horn of Africa. So starting with the first point, China and Russia are often clumped together as authoritarian non-Western actors, which are actively trying to compete and rival the Western influence. But they do so, and which is true, but they do so in very different ways. China has developed a very deliberate, gradual, and weighty and quite stable approach to its engagement on the continent. I've called that in a recent paper, I call that an elephant strategy, meaning that we might want to try to counter, as Western actors, try to counter China, but it's a heavy weight. And I think that China is where it is, and it's not moving easily. And in contrast, although it also is a long-standing partner, Russia has really expanded its presence and its engagement in a more reactive and tenacious manner, especially after its different interventions into neighboring states. And it's done so in a quite visible way as well. Of course, with the presence of Wagner troops, even though that has been during quite some time a plausible deniability, it was very tightly linked to Russia even before the death of Prigozhin. And they've also tried to have an impact in states which are experiencing some types of armed conflict, where they can exploit more easily both the different state actors, but also, of course, natural resources. So I'd say that there is a difference between especially China and Russia. China, which has a more stable presence and has focused more on economic activities, infrastructure, access to natural resources in different ways, and Russia, which has tried to be much more of a security actor, promoting their different types of PMC mercenaries. We've just heard Michelle talking about how the definitions differ depending on what we're talking about. But for sure, Russia has for a very long time had an approach with both an informal and informal presence in their African partner states. And now we're at the Africa Core. I'm sure that Henny will speak a little bit more about this in a while. So the first point is then that we see these authoritarian non-Western actors often as a block, but we should make sure that we see the diversity and the difference between them, because they have very different approaches in the way that they relate. And we can see that specifically in the Sahel, where Russia is present through the Africa Core now in 3 of the states, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, whereas China has really tried much more to be present in terms of artisanal mining, sometimes illegal, sometimes legal. Coming to my second point, and that's regarding Russia's engagement with its different partner states in the Sahel, which it has often framed around a narrative of liberation, anti-colonial discourse, and empowerment. And together with Jack Watling, we wrote a paper last year where we challenged that approach, and we challenged that narrative by pointing at different ways in which Russia is trying to lock in their partners in various ways. I think that we can say that Russia has also a diversified approach when they engage. It's not only security related. Of course, it's the deployment of mercenary or state-linked military groups, arms deliveries. Up until the war in Ukraine, Russia was by far the main exporter of arms to the continent. But we also have information operations on the continent, and specifically then in the Sahel, often paired with access to mineral concessions and political protection for regimes. So we are arguing in that paper that while Russia is promoting that liberation narrative, in practice, what they're doing is that they lock in their partners in different ways. And they do that through we're identifying three different ways. First, by making their partners untouchable. I'm coming back to these points in a little bit. And second, an economic isolation. And then third, through close protection and surveillance. So starting with the first point of how Russia locks in their partners, I think my colleague, Mr. Diallo, has just explained what type of torture strategies, human rights abuses, and different types of violence that the Wagner group has used in Mali. And in many ways, that also means that by bringing in the national army or the local security sectors in these violence, they are making their partners untouchable for other partners. That's not to say that the Malian army had a clean track record for human rights before the entrance of Russia, but it has really deteriorated, and I'm sure that Henny might talk about that because ACLED has quite a lot of data on how it has deteriorated. So the fact that FAMA, for example, but also the Central African Republic armed forces and Sudanese forces are working together with the Russian troops also makes them compliant in many of these atrocities. And we heard about the Mora massacre, which is one of the biggest ones. The second point is economic isolation. Russia has really tried to isolate their partners from other external actors by encouraging, nationalizing, revising different types of mining regulations, for example, to make sure that they will be the only partner. That has not really worked that well in all different states where they're deployed, but it has really encouraged or driven a movement of nationalization of natural resources and mines across the Sahel region, as we can see in the 3 AES states. And we've also seen that there has been a pushback against Western companies in that domain. And then the third way that Russia is locking in their partners is by close protection and surveillance, and that's a very face value point, whereby they provide regime security, often by having lifeguards or military personnel close by the president in power. And we've seen that in Central African Republic with Touadéra, and we're now seeing it in some of the states in the Sahel again, but to a lesser extent. But of course, it means that if you have these troops deployed close by, that also means not just a physical risk for the president in case it wants to turn its back towards Russia, but it also means that they're always there when there are discussions with other partners, which of course makes it more difficult for the African partner states to break loose and engage with an alternative security partner. And then my last point, and I will be very quick on this one, turning the gaze towards Turkey. I think that this is the actor that has perhaps benefited the most from the current global power competition by playing on its role as a middle power in between the West. Even though it's part of the NATO, it's also been flirting with Russia, and it clearly wants to make sure that it's not associated with Western states alone. So it really plays on that type of middle position in between Russia, China on the one hand, and Western states on the other hand. And that is also a position that is managed to exploit and instrumentalize in its engagement in Africa. And since about 10, 15 years, it has really increased its presence. We know that they went from 12 to 42 embassies on the continent between 2003 and 2019. And it is now up to 44 embassies, which is pretty much the same as France. And the US has 50. It has also opened embassies in the 3 Sahel AES states in between 2010 and 2012. And it has made sure that it has direct flights with Turkish Airlines to quite a lot of capitals on the African continent, which might seem as a minor point, but we know that access and direct access to the partner states with which you're working is really changing the collaborations for the better, of course. And given that France no longer has Air France going to many of the Sahel states, that also makes Turkey's power or influence in that region even more important. And perhaps the last point on Turkey before I conclude is that they have also managed to have quite a broad approach. They've both invested in infrastructure, building very visible hotels and airports, and notably in Niamey, but also in AU capital of Addis Ababa. Things where they can have a presence for a longer term, and which is something that can promote Turkey on a broader state. They've also invested quite heavily in building hospitals and also mosques, so they have a religious influence as well. And of course, their main asset right now, as we're talking, is that they become the Africa's leading supplier of drones. Their Bayraktar drones is now the main weapon, or the main the main weapon bought by different states. They have now a total of 32 agreements with different states in Africa to buy drones. So for all of those reasons, I think that Turkey is one of the states that we should start to look more into, and perhaps not forget about Russia, but try to put it in a relative, in a broader context with other actors as well. And I see that my time is up, so I'll end it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you for your insights. We are now giving the floor to Enin Saibia, who is a West Africa Senior Analyst at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, leading the conflict data collection and analysis for the Sahel. He is also the director of MENA Stream, and his research focuses on insurgencies and non-state actors in Sahelian countries, and he has over 50 years of experience in researching the broader MENA region. He will be sharing insight from ACLED's data on what has changed since Africa Corps took over from Wagner Group, and what impact he sees the recent engagement in Mali having on the security situation going forward. Thank you, and Eni, you have the floor.
Thank you, Habib, and also congratulations on this report by GI-TOC and for organizing today's event. And also thanks to the audience for joining us today. Again, I'm Henia Saibia, Senior Analyst for West Africa at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, or ACLED. And I'm gonna begin with a brief retrospective, because over the past few years, Russian and mercenary forces has become the most consequential external forces shaping Mali's conflict environment. So what began as the Wagner Group's deployment in late 2021 has now evolved into a new phase under the Africa Corps. This transition has brought about both continuity and change in terms of tactics, geography, and the human cost of the war. And before the withdrawal of Wagner, I want to highlight a sort of mixed bag of both successes and setbacks, because they did achieve some strategic and tactical gains. It helped the Malian army recapture key strongholds that had long been under militant or rebel control, including towns like Kidal, Ber, and Nefis. And these were not only symbolic victories, they really represented the first time in years, in the case of Kidal, even a decade, that state forces had reasserted control over these northern towns. And Wagner was also highly active in combat. And our data, or ACLED's data, shows that Wagner has engaged in far more battles than the Africa Corps until to date, but also the caveat that the time frame is very different. Wagner was deployed for several years, and Africa Corps more recently, officially in June, with Wagner's withdrawal. However, I want to underscore that we saw or obtain reports of Africa Corps deployment and even replacing Wagner units already in April 2025. So beyond the official announcement, that kind of transition began much earlier. And above everything, as my colleague Mr. Osman Diallo already mentioned, Wagner Group were involved in widespread mass atrocities across both the northern and central regions of Mali. And as he already mentioned, the most well-known cases being Moura, but also in Hombori, around Niono and around Nara. And these were very widespread, encompassing large parts of the Mopti and Sego regions in central Mali. And these operations were devastating in terms of human losses, but also shifted the balance of fear among civilians, and in a way replaced the threat from jihadist groups with the so-called, or you can describe it as terror or fear from counterinsurgency raids. And in the short term, this approach produced some results. Jihadi groups, they retreated to a certain degree, but also began operating according to a logic of avoidance. And by doing so, they shifted to engaging more in remote violence. That is use of IEDs or improvised explosive devices, landmines, and more recently, drones. So that was really a change in how Wagner impacted the conflict environment. They also introduced tactics that never had been deployed before by state forces or their partners in Mali. I mean, you have seen external forces being deployed there for a decade before, including the UN peacekeeping mission MINUSMA, but also French forces of Operation Barkhane and later Takuba. But they began, beheading local civilians, but also militants in some cases, booby trapping corpses, detonating infrastructure and destroying critical infrastructure for the civilian population, including wells and water towers and similar things, but also engaging in widespread looting of civilian property, including vehicles, livestock, motorcycles, valuables, and many other things. So this also contributed to leading what I would describe as a form of deep resentment among communities. And as Mr. Diallo highlighted, the Fulani community has really borne the brunt of the violence. But I would also add that it has expanded beyond the Fulani, even farmer communities living in areas under militant influence, like the Dogon, in some cases also Bambara, and from many other ethnic groups have been similarly affected by mass atrocities, but also people from neighboring countries, including traders and herders coming from Mauritania, and with the seasonal movements coming from southern Mauritania into southwestern Mali. So yeah, it has contributed to this form of resentment, but also militant recruitment, escalated above all indiscriminate violence, and blurred the moral lines of the conflict within Mali. And Wagner's presence did, however, enable something that is still significant to mention, and that is the return of the Malian Armed Forces, or FAMA, to parts of both the central and northern Mali, where FAMA had struggled to operate alone, but with Russian logistical and combat support, FAMA re-established a more significant footprint in the regions of Gao, Menaka, Timbuktu, and Kidal. However, despite these advances, Wagner's overall impact was quite limited, and I would detail this in various ways. So under Wagner's watch, JNIM maintained, for instance, its operational tempo in central Mali. It expanded operations to southern and western regions, and even around the outskirts of Bamako itself, the capital. And in the case of JNIM jihadi rival, the Islamic State Sahel province, also known as ISSP, that group solidified its control in much of the Menaka region, except for the regional capital itself, which Wagner has been effective in defending. So alongside the Malian armed forces and local militias like Gatia and MSA, they have been able to protect or repel attacks targeting Menaka town. So that is one of the successes. But at the same time, ISSP has consolidated its influence or territorial control in the Menaka region, also expanded, but also contracted in parts of the Gao region. And Wagner's efforts helped Mali maintain security in urban centers like Gao, Ansongo, and Menaka, but also apply pressure on the Gao Ansongo Labezanga axis, which has even caused some defections in the ranks of ISSP. But I mean, combined, all these both strategic and tactical achievements have not really translated into any lasting stability because Wagner left behind a state or the state of Mali as highly fragmented. But I want to move a little bit fast forward to the present and the shift and transition to the Africa Corps. So, as I already mentioned, they formally began operations in June 2025, although the deployments were already reported in April, as I said. So, Africa Corps also absorbed parts of Wagner's personnel, including rank and file, but obviously reorganized under much closer Russian state control and under a new form of costume. And it has also been active for less than a year, so roughly 6 months, which means that any comparison between Africa Corps activities and Wagner must be made very cautiously. So, but still, early trends have emerged in the data and also according to local accounts. And I would say that the most striking shift is geographic. The Africa Corps is much more concentrated in northern Mali, especially around Kidal, Gao, Timbuktu, and Menaka. And its presence in the central and southern region is extremely limited when compared to Wagner. And its deployments are also much more urban, especially in major towns like those already mentioned, or at more fortified military bases, rather than being dispersed through widespread patrols or offensive operations or just manning rural outposts, like, for instance, in parts of Douentza, where Wagner managed to establish a presence, but also to man these sort of rural military outposts. And combined, these are observations not only reflected in the data, but also local sources confirm these observations that they see fewer joint operations, less patrols, night raids, but also a decline in abductions, forced disappearances, and the rest that were very common under Wagner, often associated or accompanied by, torture, atrocities and other forms of heinous acts. So, in short, what we have seen so far during the deployment or the transition to Africa Corps is a body or entity that is less predatory than Wagner. Still, we see at the same time a continuity of the overall trends, but still not comparable in the scale. So deliberate civilian killings, they do continue, same as abductions, property destructions, including the looting of vehicles, livestock, and civilian infrastructure. But still, these are much smaller in scale, more localized, and maybe also more selective. And we don't see the same collective punishment that was very widespread during the time of Wagner. But also on the battlefield, the differences are equally similar, with Africa Corps being involved in far fewer battles than Wagner. It also operates much more cautiously, relying heavily on air support, and coming back to the point that, yeah, even though maybe those selling armed drones to countries in the region that may deny that no third party is operating these Turkish drones, there are accumulating accounts or at least reports by local sources and in the media that says that these drones are co-operated by Russian troops or mercenaries and Malian forces. But also another impact on the broader conflict environment is how militant and rebel groups have adapted, because they have also begun deploying drones, armed drones in various forms, kamikaze drones, or using what we often refer to as drone-delivered explosives with IEDs or explosive payloads dropped from hobby drones or civilian drones. And this is something that is particularly notable in the north of Mali, with the Azawad Liberation Front making it a central aspect of its operations. But I also think that the topography of northern Mali, with the vast deserts and less densely populated areas, make these types of remote engagements more of a relevant choice for that group, even though JNIM also used them, but they haven't developed such an advanced program as FLA. But instead, it's one aspect of a much broader repertoire of tactics that JNIM deploys. But combined, they have all adapted the way in they engage and deploying much more remote violence. And this is how we see that the Africa Corps also is targeted. It's primarily their convoys along logistical routes or their fixed positions in northern Mali's towns. But yeah, this pattern is also quite consistent with what you can expect from insurgents that are strategically inferior in terms of not having an air force or the same strategic advantages as state forces. So it's like the poor man's bomb, to use IDs, and also adapting whatever components they can find to use weaponized drones. But overall, Africa Corps' urban and northern bias has made it somewhat more predictable, but also less vulnerable to attacks than, for instance, the Wagner group, which was much more engaged on the battlefield, but also suffered heavy losses. I think the case of Tinsawaten on the border with Algeria, in a way, marked the end of Wagner's deployment, in a way, or at least a significant decline in its activities across Mali. So while Wagner's time or era in Mali was defined by these high intensity operations and mass atrocities, Africa Corps' arrival has not changed the equation, let's say, because the center of the country, but also now increasingly the south and western parts, remain highly contested. JNIM continues to operate freely across large swaths of both central and southern Mali. Ongoing developments, including the fuel embargo, launched as a form of economic warfare, has severely disrupted transportation and trade. Fuel shortages now affect nearly every region, including Bamako itself, placing the military regime itself in a very kind of precarious situation. Major transit routes face constant pressure, and the government's ability to sustain logistics for both the army and the economy is weakening. And in this context, Africa Corps has a very limited footprint, and I think it also looks increasingly insufficient as a partner force, providing for the needs of the Malian military and the regime itself. And yeah, while the group's focus is on the north, it's largely absent from the areas where JNIM is imposing its fuel embargo. And yeah, it has put the Malian leadership in a very dangerous situation for them, at least, since they are under increasing pressure. And also looking forward makes this very difficult. It's very difficult to project trends with confidence in a very fast-paced environment where we look at a time frame of even weeks or months, or how the Malian regime will be able to effectively respond to this fuel embargo with, even the capital drying out in terms of fuel. You see embassies making notifications almost daily, calling on residents to leave the country due to the uncertainty that prevails, even in the capital of Mali itself. And for that reason, even speaking about Africa Corps itself makes the future very uncertain, because it's very tied not so much to Russian priorities, but rather to the survival of Mali's current regime. So yeah, any attempt to forecast beyond the near term must come with really strong caveats. And with that, I wrap up, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Heini, for your insights. I think we are running against the time, but we will take some questions before we go. We will start with two first questions. How credible is the UN as a monitor of and rapporteur on Wagner and Wagnerism in the Sahel, given Russia's veto power on UNSC? And this can be grouped with how should international law interpret state complicity where foreign mercenaries act with the government concerned yet commit violation amounting to war crimes? Colleagues, you can go. Michelle, I think you have the floor.
Thank you, Habib. I just want to pause here because I know that one of our colleagues had to leave quite urgently on time. So does Nina want to perhaps speak first?
I think perhaps Nina might have just had to leave already.
Okay.
But thanks, Michelle, for flagging that. But yeah, unfortunately, if anyone in the chat has specific questions for Nina, we may be able to pass those along in future. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Habib. Yeah, so the question on the credibility of the UN, particularly around the special rapporteur, I can't comment on that individual example. I don't know enough about it. But perhaps a reply is to encourage the audience members to read the reports of the working group. We have covered many, many different thematic areas: maritime, arms, illicit financing. We've looked at predatory recruitment, and I think that's particularly relevant to all of these conflicts. And our forthcoming reports, they're actually, one's going to be on technology and one's going to be on organized crime, because organized crime keeps coming up and up again. And actually, these nodes are proliferating. So one is to read the reports. The other is to read the allegation letters. So we have a number of allegation letters with Mali, with Wagner, and with Russia. And I'd encourage you to go and look at those. As well as submissions, the public ones that are made to the working group. Those are also really rich. So in terms of our credibility, I hope that we can prove it in the data that we are producing. But I think there's an implicit question is about what then? And that really is for states to act. The data is there, the reporting is there. And I think, as the question alluded to, often veto power prevents things from going ahead. But there are other avenues for seeking accountability and justice. And one that is being touted a lot through civil society organizations is establishing a commission of inquiry, particularly on Wagner. So that is maybe one source of information that the individual can explore. And I mentioned earlier the IGWG and PMSCs, and while that's a separate actor, what CSOs are learning is that when states don't fulfill their duties, what other mechanisms can be explored. And so around this, there is an attempt by Trial and ICOCA and a number of other partners to establish the Business Accountability Initiative, which specifically looks at these range of issues. And then just to touch on the international law question. So to give you an idea, only 37 states have signed the UN Convention on Mercenaries. In terms of the OEU Convention, only 32 states have signed that convention. So in terms of being able to pursue violations committed by mercenaries, if states don't sign and ratify these conventions, then we don't have the legal frameworks in which to pursue justice, accountability, and remedy. So again, it comes back to states really needing to fulfill their obligations in this regard. And it comes back to my comments earlier about commissions of inquiries. I mean, civil society also has a really important role here to play. And Usman really took us through all those range of violations. But collecting and documenting witness testimonies is a really, really important task now. And hopefully justice will be served down the line. Here thinking about the ICC, which certain states are really seeking to dismantle. So perhaps I can pause there and allow my colleagues to also give their inputs.
Thank you, dear Michelle. The floor is open to the other panelists for the other questions. Thanks. Okay, so Heini, there is a question saying, what lessons can African militaries draw from Wagner operational methods, both in countering their influence and in improving national defense? And how has Wagner influenced the tactics and force posture of regional multilateral forces, such as G5, in operational planning and battlefield engagement? Do you want to take this on? You have the floor.
Yeah, so first of all, the G5 Sahel force is more or less defunct, or I would even say defunct, because all the AES countries have formed their own defense pact ever since, and yeah, other countries like Mauritania has, from what I recall, withdrawn their membership. So yeah, the G5 Sahel force have little lessons to learn from that, but I think that regional militaries can learn or take lessons from what I've seen. I think that Wagner has been most successful with when they have had air support or air cover during military raids and operations. So often helicopter supported operations have yielded most of their tactical victories, not drone strikes. Instead, drone strikes have been used very indiscriminately and often targeting miners or transporters or people just moving in vehicles in the north and so forth. So yeah, this indiscriminate violence has been quite widespread, but I also think that is a good lesson to learn from. That is probably not going to bring a viable solution to end conflict, but instead only increasing instability. And we see the ramifications of that today. What has happened in central Mali has often boosted militant groups, and in the case, this is very pronounced in the case of JNIM, as they have entrenched themselves in central Mali, but from there also use these areas as strongholds or staging grounds for further expansion into western and the southern parts of Mali. So yeah, I think that is a good lesson for them to learn. They, as mentioned earlier in the webinar, the Malian forces themselves doesn't have a very clean track record in terms of human rights violations, but it was not comparable to that of Wagner. So there is a quite significant shift in the scale and the magnitude of violence employed by Wagner. But yeah, overall, they have strategic advantages by acquiring drones and also like learning from the more kind of tactical capabilities that Wagner has brought with them. So they certainly have been able to learn from that, but also from intelligence gathering and other aspects of counterinsurgency operations. But yeah, to kind of wrap it up, I think these are some of the lessons they can learn from.
Thank you very much, dear Annie. Now we will take another question. Sorry. There was a question for Usman.
Thank you very much, Habib. I think there was a question about the involvement of or the importance of the Ukrainian conflict in Mali. And I think it's very interesting, like that it has been raised because it has become topical in Mali. And Wagner, as we know, was also deployed in Ukraine and conducted operations there, including war crimes. Prigozhin was navigating between Ukraine and Sahel and Central African Republic. And there have been rumors that Ukrainian special forces have provided support to the Azawad Liberation Front, especially in drone usage and warfare. And talks have been amounting about the importance of that training in the Wagner defeat at Tinzawatan in July 2024. And the Malian government has denounced Ukrainian involvement in supporting the Azawad Liberation Front. And even in their public communications, you can see that they are getting aligned closer with Russia by talking about denazification in Mali, which is completely sometimes, not relevant to the Malian theater. So thank you.
Sorry, I was still muted. Thank you very much, Usman. I can see that the time is up, but we can take one more question with Julia that can also wrap up this webinar on shifting balance of power using of informants and integration of local militia into Wagner.
Sure, Habib, I can actually provide a quite simple response to that question to say it's not something that our research really covered. I realised that there are several questions in the chat that actually speak to some very specific operational matters between Wagner and FAMA. And put simply, it's not something that we were able to gather information on. You know, a lot of the information is available, but it's very fragmentary, and we've tried to build up as big a picture as we can of Wagner's operations in Mali through our research. But ultimately, it's a very challenging context in which to conduct research. It's obviously a live conflict zone in which these forces are operating. So our information will always be fragmentary to a certain extent, imperfect. And it's something we'll continue to gather research on in the future. I've seen some of the other questions as well, but just to address a couple of points. Some of the questions have asked about whether this arms sharing became a point of tension between Wagner Group and the Malian armed forces. Some succinct answer is to simply say yes, their relationship deteriorated over time, disputes over arms sharing and the access of arms between the different forces. And that actually, contributed to Wagner operating more independently of FAMA over time during their operations in Mali. So yeah, thank you for the questions, and I'll be available to discuss further if people want to approach after the webinar.
So we are at the end of this webinar. Thanks everyone for being here. And if you have further questions, please, for the panelists, please feel free to get in touch. And you can also read our full study on our website, www.globalinitiative.net. Thank you, and you all have a nice day. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks to the other panelists for joining as well. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.